I was asked to talk about the 2024 International Summit, the Societal Role of Meat and Livestock, which we hosted in Denver this past October. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about how this developed and evolved. A group of scientists from around the world essentially independently came together and determined that they were tired of being targeted by essentially activism around the world, targeting specifically animal agriculture and the meat industry. And so this group developed an affinity with each other and put together the meeting that is described on the slide in front of you, which turned out to be the International Summit of the Societal Role of Meat. It was conducted in October of 2022 in Dublin, Ireland. It was hosted by Chigask, and Declan Troy was the leader of that meeting. And coming out of that meeting was an effort to try and consolidate the evidence that has been developed in the literature that supports or at least provides better policy analysis for the role of livestock in our society today. And the primary outcome of that meeting, Peter already mentioned, was what we call the Dublin Declaration. The Dublin Declaration doesn't tell people what we expect them to eat. What it says is that we hope that policymakers around the world will use science-based evidence when making policy decisions regarding the lives of people in all countries. That Dublin Declaration has now been signed by scientists from all over the world. The last count that we have is 1,229 scientists have signed it. It's still available to be signed if you want to log in and do so. Following the meeting in 2022, all of our team at Colorado State University was asked to put together a second meeting and host it in the Denver metro area. We hosted it at our campus in Denver. And this was the planning group that came together, again, sort of independently and without structure, to plan this meeting. The Denver Summit was basically in follow-up to the Dublin meeting with the goal of maybe refining and providing the newest information that was available that could help secure sort of an evidence-based policy development platform. We did this meeting a week before the national elections, so you can imagine that our timing might have been a bit off, at least in North America. But quite surprisingly, we had a number of policymakers in the room during the meeting. We ended up having 178 total guests from 21 different countries. We broke the meeting into 4 sessions, including health and nutrition, ecology and the environment, societal considerations, which I'll discuss more in a second, and then what do we need to do as a scientific group working in animal agriculture to move the ball forward. Our conclusions coming out of this meeting, you'll see some of them at the end of the presentation, but we think that we need to establish a more proactive effort towards moving information into the policy formation arena. Just like with the meeting that was hosted in Dublin, we were given a special edition of Animal Frontiers, came out this past March. It was the February edition, published in March. And if you have an interest in some of the information that was provided in the meeting from the speakers, they've all contributed to the papers that were peer-reviewed and published in this Animal Frontiers edition. We also have a website up online that you can go to called the societalroleofmeat.org, and all of the presentations from the Denver meeting are available, both their slide presentations and the videos of the presentations are available if you have an interest in looking at any of them. The primary outcome of the Denver meeting last October is what we referred to as the Denver Call for Action. The Denver Call for Action, as I indicated, implies that there is a greater need for proactive engagement with society on the things that we all work with as scientists to better inform the formation of policy and, more importantly perhaps, to overcome misinformation that's out there regarding animal production, animal agriculture. We started this concept in the Denver meeting by trying to address what we referred to as competency and agenda-driven science. Pierre Ederer, who's one of the planners for the project in Denver, is a scientist. He lives in Switzerland. He did an analysis last year and published this paper that came out last April, a year ago in April. And it basically evaluated 4 really primary research efforts, quote unquote, that had been used in the formation of policy, particularly at FAO and the United Nations and at WHO, regarding several topics which are listed there on the slide. And what he ended up finding out as he performed this analysis is that the authors in all the examples that he evaluated here basically had published conclusions that were contrary to the conclusions that were published in these overarching evidence-based policy documents. And so that is a problem. And it's a problem that implies that there are personal agendas that are infiltrating the formation of policy, but being cloaked as scientific evidence when in fact they're not. This never became more evident than this past year when a paper was published in this particular journal, basically targeting specific scientists for their work to try and do things that improved livestock production and its impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. You'll recognize the scientists that are highlighted there in blue. And my take on this, and I don't know how many people will agree with me, but this is not science. This is specific targeting to basically undermine the act of science and the act of development of new information. And if you go back and look at the authors of this article, one of them is not qualified to actually publish any kind of criticism about the scientific method, and the other author has never published anything except activist-based documents, right just down the road from us in Miami. And so I have a significant problem with the journal that has agreed to publish something like this as a quote-unquote peer-reviewed document that is entering the domain of science. This journal should be taken off the scientific document list. As we started out the meeting, we wanted to reflect on what had happened between the Dublin meeting and the Denver meeting. And so we asked Frederick Leroy, whom many of you know from Belgium, to come in and start laying that course of platform. He talked about, from the nutrition perspective, this historical evolution of dietary guidelines that has evolved, that the point being were to help people, quote unquote, become more healthy by telling them what to eat. And his construct has been something like this. Each and every one of these dietary guidances on what you should eat or what you shouldn't eat is not frequently founded in what is known relative to factual science. And one of the best demonstrations of this was John Ioannidis, who said that the health claims in the Eat Lancet diet are science fiction. I can't call it anything else. And the point of this is the people that have promulgated, for example, the Eat Lancet diet are getting ready to launch Eat Lancet 2 this upcoming September. And as an industry, if we're not prepared for this, then it's going to overwhelm us. The fact of the matter is that if you looked at just data in North America, the evolution and the implementation of dietary guidelines have been completely ineffective. obesity has increased almost linearly in the United States since the implementation of the first dietary guidelines. And so, in fact, based on data that's evidence, the recommendations that are being made are not effective in helping improve societal health. Ty Beal, who's at Washington University in St. Louis, does work on evaluating the introduction of micronutrients into human diets. And he published this work last year and talked about it in our meeting in Denver. If you look at where the sources of micronutrients are that can basically improve human health and society, they're not in plant-based diets, they're in animal-based diets. And they're not saying that you shouldn't have a well-rounded diet. What they're saying is that animal-sourced diets play an important role in providing micronutrients that are necessary in human health. Andrew Mente, who's in Canada, presented some of the work that they've been conducting, and I didn't even know this study was underway, but it's something we should all be aware of. They basically worked with collaborators around the world to evaluate the health aspects of diet in 80 different countries. And you can see the list of collaborators on this project is pretty extensive. They basically included almost 245,000 observations in this study, which is the first that I'm aware of anywhere in the world to look at dietary impacts on health across multiple nations. And if you look at what they found, and I'm just showing you data relative to coronary heart disease here, but if you look at the data across those 80 countries, what Andrew has shown pretty conclusively is that meat-based diets actually reduce health impacts relative to cardiovascular disease. And they've looked at this for other chronic diseases as well, and they're finding the same sorts of things across multiple countries. This is important information, and if it's not used in formation of policy, then something is wrong in our system. So Frederick summarized by saying we need to start thinking across the globe in terms of more important ways of providing nutrition to all populations. And he refers to this as the nourishment table. And the nourishment table is based on reducing levels of heavily processed foods in the diet while improving intake of nutrient-rich foods in the diet, and then moderating all of those things based on culture and location and region of the world that somebody lives in, which is a way more reasonable and logical mechanism for trying to improve human health if you look at it from a global perspective. Pablo Manzano from Spain came up and ran the next session regarding ecology and the environment. And he talked about the carbon opportunity cost of animal-sourced food production in the diet. Sarah is going to be on the program following me, so I'm not going to take too much of the thunder here. But I want you to know that this was a pretty well-refined component of the meeting. This was Sarah's presentation at our meeting last October. She's going to talk to you again this morning about some of this, the role of livestock production in greenhouse gas emissions. She said that using differing accounting approaches, you can look at beef production regionally around the world, and you can show hugely different impacts relative to emissions. And so this is something I'm sure she'll talk to you about this morning, and it's become an important component for thinking about regionalization of how we manage livestock. Enrique Marie, who's from South Africa, talked about a new system that's going to become available for helping guide producers in range management relative to their specific locale. And this system's not up and running yet, but it will be soon. And I think that it's going to be useful from the perspective that it will guide producers to address their local needs and concerns rather than global needs and concerns as are being promoted today. So she looks at basically the different ecological terrains that are available around the planet, and she talks about how we need to guide livestock production based on those ecological differences in regions around the world. We also talked in our third session about animal welfare concerns. Most of you know that in North America, this is the number one concern after price that consumers have for production of livestock. And so we talked, Ed Pager from Calgary talked about where we are today in terms of managing animal well-being and welfare. He talked about the difference between when we had an agrarian model of society prior to 1950, particularly in North America, versus a modern food production system where most consumers today in society are several generations removed from actual agricultural production. And that changes how we have to communicate what we do as producers or as what we do as scientists to those members, consumers in society. He said that the majority of people still hold values about how food is produced without having any direct involvement in that production. And so we have to address those concerns. And I believe that, at least in North America, we've taken measures to do so. Ellison Van Inneman, who was here yesterday, had to leave today, but she talked with us about new technologies that are becoming available to further address some of the concerns that society might have about a number of factors, including diet health and also environmental impacts of livestock. She talked about some of the new technologies that are available, for example, gene modification that can be used in improving or reducing greenhouse gas emissions while improving efficiencies of production. She talked about the fact that the primary roadblocks to using these technologies today are basically regulatory approvals and the lack of decision-making on the basis of policy in most governments. She summarized by talking about genetic improvement as permanent and cumulative. This has traditionally involved conventional selection using range of technologies, but genetic improvement has not been as rapid. It's home to 76% of the global cattle herd and 75% of the global ruminant greenhouse gas emissions. So there are multiple reasons for including these technologies as we move forward in trying to reduce the impact of livestock on climate and other aspects of society. She talked about the synergies of genomics, advanced reproductive technologies, and biotechnology opportunities in trying to address some of these needs. And then lastly, we had a philosopher come in. Paul Thompson has just retired from Michigan State University. He talked with us about what society believes from a philosophical perspective versus what we understand animal production to be. He talked about these four buckets of moral considerations, if you will: the technological modernization, regional food systems, sustainable intensification, and urban agriculture, and how these relate in terms of perception philosophically to the bulk of society. His take-home message was that evaluation, and especially communication, needs to recognize and accommodate the growing complexity of the ethical landscape for animal-based foods. And he particularly emphasized the need for better communication, which you're going to see as a primary outcome from this meeting. He also said that in comparison to the biomedical sector, to information technology and the built environment, the agricultural sector is underinvested in capacity for ethical analysis, meaning we're not putting enough money and effort and resources into addressing this component of how society perceives animal agriculture. Craig Gunderson's an economist with Baylor School of Medicine in Houston. He talked about the impacts of bad policy on the availability of nutrients to a significant component of the population. If you say that somewhere in the neighborhood of 25% of the population in North America is compromised today relative to access to nutrition, every time that a new regulatory requirement or a price increase is imposed on that population, it becomes larger. And that's true globally. And so we have to be cognizant of how we're making nutrition available to all of the population that potentially consumes meat products. He talked about these studies that have been conducted demonstrating that conclusively relative to estimates regarding the food insecure amounts of populations that are affected by regulatory oversight and increasing prices as a consequence. We ended up our presentations in the Denver meeting with a talk by Alexa Lamb. For those of you that don't know Alexis, she works in animal agriculture-based communication field. She's well known and understood to have a better idea of how we could do a better job in communicating science to the general public. This is her space. She talks about that we have audience segmentation that we have to focus on. And this audience segmentation has become continually more polarized, as you're all aware, during recent years. And so this becomes problematic in terms of trying to communicate with the population on any ongoing basis. She talks about the vast amounts of information being available to consumers, but consumers don't go into the literature and digest and read that information. They're basically exposed to that information in 8-second sound bites. And so if you're going to consolidate everything that all of us do into 8-second sound bites and expect to have an impact on what society feels about the role of science in livestock and meat animal production, then we have to do a better job of developing those 8-second sound bites to convey more important and prioritized information. She also talks about the audience and the fact that the audience message that is received has to correspond with the channels that they're receiving information on and the source of the information. Certain consumers have different preferences for how they evaluate new information, whether it's on social media platforms or other platforms, and you have to go to where the consumers are getting their information if you want to have an impact. This was a paper that was published this past year in Science magazine. It talked about a broader view of misinformation that's being disseminated in the industry. Across all scientific involvement. This study evaluated information that was being provided specifically on results of science, and what they found is that there are what they referred to as super sharers of information on social media channels. And those super sharers of misinformation can have disproportionate impacts on the outcomes tied to what society believes about a given topic, in our case, animal agriculture. So super sharers of misinformation can have what they call outsized harm on the beliefs in society, and we're currently experiencing that, as you all are aware. Just a few weeks ago, this study was published also in Science magazine. It dealt with partisan disparities for the use of science in policy formation, specifically in the United States, but they said that you could extrapolate these results across multiple countries around the world. And you can see clearly from their analysis that there's differences across the aisle, if you will, in how the different parties choose to use scientific information. But the thing that becomes most important from this study is there's also overlap. And that overlap area, or what the authors believe, becomes important. They said in that final bullet down there, a better understanding of this core of bipartisan cited science could further demonstrate the value of science across the political spectrum and reveal new avenues for fostering mutual understanding. So, as scientists, this should be the domain that we hope to play in and communicate the results of our efforts out to society through that mechanism. A path forward, I want to just quote a study that was published in PNAS last year. They said that most of society today is relatively ignorant, and I use that in the best terms of the word, about the scientific method and what's entailed in the development of new information that society can be exposed to. And so what they said is that if we're going to be scientists and we hope for society to understand the results of what we do, we have to do a better job in helping them understand the science, at least components of the scientific method, so that they can understand, so that society can understand the results of our work. We need to help society understand what's good and what's bad science. Perhaps not the full details of that kind of an analysis, but they need to be able to sort the wheat from the chaff and be able to understand when they're seeing good information versus bad information. This becomes incumbent upon every one of us as scientists as we move forward into the next components of our careers. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to share some of this results of this meeting with you. I think you're going to really enjoy the other speakers on this platform this morning, and thank you all. Appreciate it.